Development as Freedom by Amartya. Chapter 5 Markets, State and Social Opportunity. It is the customary fate of new truths, says T.H. Huxley in Science and Culture, to begin as heresies and to end as superstitions. Something very like this seems to have happened about the truth of the importance of markets in economic life. There was a time, not very long ago, when every young economist knew in what respect the market systems had serious limitations. All the textbooks repeated the same lists of defects. The intellectual rejection of the market mechanism often led to radical proposals for altogether different methods of organizing the world, sometimes involving a powerful bureaucracy and unimagined fiscal burdens, without serious examination of the possibility that the proposed alternatives might involve even bigger failures than the markets were expected to produce. There was, often enough, rather little interest in the new and additional problems that the alternative arrangements may create. The intellectual climate has changed quite dramatically over the last few decades, and the tables are now turned. The virtues of the market mechanism are now standardly assumed to be so pervasive that qualifications seem unimportant. Any pointer to the defects of the market mechanism appears to be, in the present mood, strangely old-fashioned and contrary to contemporary culture, like playing an old 78 RPM record with music from the 1920s. One set of prejudices has given way to another, opposite set of preconceptions. Yesterday's unexamined faith has now become today's heresy, and yesterday's heresy is now the new superstition. The need for critical scrutiny of standard preconceptions and politico-economic attitudes has never been stronger. Today's prejudices in favor of the pure market mechanism certainly need to be carefully investigated and, I would argue, partly rejected. But what we have to avoid resurrecting yesterday's follies that refuse to see the merits of, indeed even the inescapable need for, markets. We have to scrutinize and decide what parts make sense in the respective perspectives. My illustrious countryman Gautama Buddha may have been too predisposed to see the universal need for the middle path, though he did not get around to discussing the market mechanism in particular, but there is something to be learned from his speeches on non-extremism delivered 2,500 years ago. Markets, liberty and labour. Even though the merits of the market mechanism are now very widely acknowledged, the reasons for wanting markets are often not fully appreciated. This issue was discussed in the introduction and in the first chapter of this book, but I must return to it briefly in examining the institutional aspects of development. In recent discussions, the focus in assessing the market mechanism has tended to be on the results it ultimately generates, such as the incomes or the utilities yielded by the markets. This is not a negligible issue, and I shall come to it presently. But the more immediate case for the freedom of market transaction lies in the basic importance of that freedom itself. We have good reasons to buy and sell, to exchange, and to seek lives that can flourish on the basis of transactions. To deny that freedom in general would be in itself a major failing of society. This fundamental recognition is prior to any theorem we may or may not be able to prove, on which more presently, in showing what the culmination outcomes of markets are in terms of incomes, utilities, and so on. The ubiquitous role of transactions in modern living is often overlooked precisely because we take them for granted. There is an analogy here with the rather under-recognized and often unnoticed role of certain behavioral rules, such as basic business ethics, in developed capitalist economies, with attention being focused only on aberrations when they occur. But when these values are not yet developed, their general presence or absence can make a crucial difference. In the analysis of development, the role of elementary business ethics thus has to be moved out of its obscure presence shift to a manifest recognition. Similarly, the absence of the freedom to transact can be a major issue in itself in many contexts. This is, of course, particularly so when the freedom of labour markets is denied by laws, regulations, or convention. Even though African American slaves in the pre-Civil War South may have had pecuniary incomes as large as, or even larger than, those of wage labourers elsewhere, and may have even lived longer than the urban workers in the North, there was still a fundamental deprivation in the fact of slavery itself, no matter what incomes or utilities it might or might not have generated. The loss of freedom in the absence of employment choice and in the tyrannical form of work can itself be a major deprivation. The development of free markets in general and of free seeking of employment in particular is a much appreciated fact in historical studies. Even that great critic of capitalism, Karl Marx, saw the emergence of freedom of employment as momentous progress, as was discussed in Chapter 1. But this issue concerns not just history, but the present as well, since this freedom is critically important right now in many parts of the world. Let me illustrate this point with 4 quite different examples. First, various forms of labour bondage can be found in many countries in Asia and Africa, and there are persistent denials of basic freedom to seek wage employment away from one's traditional bosses. When the Indian newspapers report that the upper caste landowners in one of the most backward parts of India, viz. Bihar, are terrorizing, through selective murder and rape, the families of labourers tied to their lands, there is, of course, an issue of criminality involved, which is why such incidents receive media attention, and which may ultimately be the reason why things may have to change even in these terrible communities. But underlying the criminal activities, the basic economic situation involves a battle for the freedom of employment, as well as the ownership of the land on which the tied labourers are forced to work. These arrangements continued despite their illegality, as a result of the post-independence legislation that has been only partly implemented. The situation has been more studied in India than elsewhere, as discussed in Chapter 1, but there is enough evidence that similar problems are present in several other countries as well. Second, to turn now to a very different illustration, the failure of bureaucratic socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union cannot be fully grasped merely in terms of the economic problems in generating incomes or other results, such as life expectancies. Indeed, in terms of life expectancies, the communist countries often did quite well, relatively speaking, as is readily checked from the demographic statistics of the Soviet Union, pre-reform China, Vietnam, and Cuba, among others. In fact, several of the ex-communist countries are now in a significantly worse position than they were under communist rule, perhaps nowhere more so than in Russia itself, where the life expectancy at birth of Russian men has now dropped to about 58 years, considerably below those in India or Pakistan. And yet the population is unwilling to vote to return to the previous arrangements, as election results indicate, and even the new successor parties drawing from that old political quarter do not propose such a return, and only demand rather less radical restitutions. In assessing what happened, the economic inefficiency of the communist system must, of course, be recognized. But there is also the more immediate issue of the denial of freedom in a system where markets were simply ruled out in many fields. Also, people could be disallowed from using the markets even when they existed. For example, they could be barred from seeking employment in an ongoing recruitment process, including some unfavored persons being sent to work where the bosses want them to work. In this sense, Friedrich Hayek's chastising description of the communist economies as the road to serfdom was indeed a fitting, if severe, rhetoric. In a different, but not unrelated context, Michał Kalecki, the great Polish economist who returned to Poland with great enthusiasm as the communist rule got established there, noted, in an answer to a journalist's question on Poland's progress from capitalism to socialism, Yes, we have successfully abolished capitalism. All we have to do now is to abolish feudalism. Third, as was noted in Chapter 1, in the distressing subject of child labour, as prevalent, for example, in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, there is an embedded issue of slavery and bondage, since many of the children working in exacting tasks are forced to perform them. The roots of such servitude may go back to the economic deprivation of the families from which they come. Sometimes the parents are themselves under some kind of bondage vis-à-vis the employers. And on top of the nasty issue of labouring children, there is also the barbarity of children being forced to do things. The freedom to go to school, in particular, is hampered not only by the weakness of primary educational programs in these regions, but in some cases also by the lack of any choice that the children, and often their parents, have in deciding what they want to do. The issue of child labour tends to divide South Asian economists. Some have argued that merely abolishing child labour without doing anything to enhance the economic circumstances of the families involved may not serve the interest of the children themselves. There is certainly a debatable issue here, but the frequent congruence of child labour with what effectively is slavery does make it, in those cases, a simpler choice. The starkness of slavery yields a forceful case for more vigorous enforcement of anti-slavery as well as anti-child labour legislation. The system of child labour, bad enough on its own, is made much beastlier still through its congruence with bondage and effective slavery. Fourth, the freedom of women to seek employment outside the family is a major issue in many third world countries. This freedom is systemically denied in many cultures, and this in itself is a serious violation of women's liberty and gender equity. The absence of this freedom militates against the economic empowerment of women, and also has many other consequences. Aside from the direct effects of market employment in adding to the economic independence of women, outside work is also causally important in making women have a better deal in intra-household distributions. Needless to say, women's work at home can be backbreaking, but it is rarely honoured or even recognised, and certainly not remunerated. And the denial of the right to work outside the home is a rather momentous violation of women's liberty. The prohibition of outside employment for women can sometimes be brutally executed in an explicit and fierce way, as for example in contemporary Afghanistan. In other cases, the prohibition may work more implicitly through the power of convention and conformity. Sometimes there may not even be, in any clear sense, a ban on women seeking employment, and yet women reared with traditional values may be quite afraid to break with the tradition and to shock others. The prevailing perceptions of normality and appropriateness are quite central to this question. This issue relates to other important concerns of this work, in particular, the need for open discussion of social issues and the advantage of group activities in bringing about substantial social changes. Women's organizations have begun to play a very important part in this transformation in many countries in the world. For example, Self-Employed Women's Association, or SUA, has been most effective in bringing about a changed climate of thought, not just more employment for women, in one part of India. So have participatory credit and cooperative organizations, such as the Grameen Bank and Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee, or BRAC, in Bangladesh. While emphasizing the significance of transaction and the right of economic participation, including the right to seek employment freely, and the direct importance of market-related liberties, we must not lose the sight of the complementarity of these liberties with the freedoms that come from the operation of other, non-market, institutions. This complementarity between different institutions, in particular between non-market organizations and the market, is also a central theme of this book. Markets and efficiency. The labour market can be a liberator in many different contexts, and the basic freedom of transaction can be of central importance, quite aside from whatever the market mechanism may or may not achieve in terms of incomes or utilities or other results. But it is important also to examine those consequential results, and I turn now to that rather different issue. In assessing the market mechanism, it is important to take note of the forms of the markets, whether they are competitive or monopolistic, or otherwise uncompetitive, whether some markets may be missing in ways that are not easily remediable, and so on. Also, the nature of factual circumstances, such as the availability or absence of particular kinds of information, the presence or absence of economies of large scale, may influence the actual possibilities and impose real limitations on what can be achieved through various institutional forms of the market mechanism. In the absence of such imperfections, including the non-marketability of some goods and services, classical models of general equilibrium have been used to demonstrate the merits of the market mechanism in achieving economic efficiency. This is standardly defined in terms of what economists call Pareto optimality, a situation in which the utility, or welfare, of no one can be raised without reducing the utility or welfare of someone else. This efficiency achievement, the so-called Arrow-Debreu theorem, after the original authors of those results, Kenneth Arrow and Gérard Debreu, is of real importance despite the simplifying assumptions. The Arrow-Debreu results show, inter alia, that given some preconditions, the results of the market mechanism are not improvable in ways that would enhance everyone's utility, or enhance the utility of some without reducing the utility of anyone else. It is possible, however, to question whether the efficiency sought should not be accounted in terms of individual freedoms rather than utilities. This is an especially legitimate question here, since the information focus of this work has been on individual freedoms, not utilities. I have in fact demonstrated elsewhere that in terms of some plausible characterizations of substantive individual freedoms, an important part of the Arrow-Debreu efficiency result readily translates from the space of utilities to that of individual freedoms, both in terms of freedom to choose commodity baskets and in terms of capabilities to function. In demonstrating the viability of this extension, similar assumptions are employed as are needed for the original Arrow-Debreu results, such as the presence of non-marketability. With these presumptions, it turns out that for a cogent characterization of individual freedoms, a competitive market equilibrium guarantees that no one's freedom can be increased any further while maintaining the freedom of everyone else. For this connection to be established, the importance of substantive freedom has to be judged not just in terms with the number of options one has, but with adequate sensitivity to the attractiveness of the available options. Freedom has different aspects. Personal liberties, as well as the liberty to transact, have already been discussed earlier. However, for the freedom to achieve, in line with what one wants to achieve, we have to take note of the merits of the available options. In explaining this freedom efficiency result, without going into the technicalities, it can be pointed out that given canny choice by individuals, efficiency in terms of individual utilities has to be, to a great extent, parasitic on offering the individuals adequate opportunities from which they can choose. These opportunities are not only relevant for what people choose and the utility they achieve, but also for what useful options they have and the substantive freedoms they enjoy. One particular issue may be worth clarifying here concerning the role of self-interest maximization in achieving the efficiency result of the market mechanism. In the classic Arrow-Debreu framework, it is assumed that everyone must be pursuing her self-interest as her exclusive motivation. This behavioral assumption is necessitated by the attempt to establish the result that the market outcome will be Pareto optimal, which is defined in terms of individual interests, so that no one's interest could be further enhanced without damaging the interests of others. The presumption of ubiquitous selfishness is hard to defend empirically. Also, there are circumstances more complex than those presumed in the Arrow-Debreu model, involving more direct interdependencies between the interests of different persons, in which self-interested behavior may be far from effective in generating efficient outcomes. Thus, if it were really necessary to assume universal selfishness to establish the efficiency results in the Arrow-Debreu model, then it could be seen as a serious limitation of that approach. However, this limitation can be substantially avoided by examining the demands of efficiency in terms of individual freedoms, rather than just utilities. The restriction of having to assume self-interested behavior can be removed if our primary concern is with substantive freedoms that people enjoy, no matter for what purpose they use these freedoms, not the extent to which their self-interests are fulfilled through their own self-interested behavior. No assumption need be made, in this case, about what motivates the individual's choices, since the point at issue is no longer the achievement of interest fulfillment, but the availability of freedom, no matter whether the freedom is aimed at self-interest or some other objective. The basic analytical results of the Arrow-Debreu theorem are thus quite independent of the motivations that lie behind the individual preferences, and can be left unaddressed if the object is to show efficiency in preference fulfillments or efficiency in substantive individual freedoms, irrespective of motivation. Coupling of disadvantages and inequality of freedoms. The basic result about market efficiency can, in this sense, be extended to the perspective of substantive freedoms. But these efficiency results do not say anything about the equity of outcomes, or about the equity in the distribution of freedoms. A situation can be efficient in the sense that no one's utility or substantive freedom can be enhanced without cutting into the utility or freedom of someone else, and yet there could be enormous inequalities in the distribution of utilities and freedoms. The problem of inequality in fact gets magnified as the attention is shifted from income inequality to the inequality in the distribution of substantive freedoms and capabilities. This is mainly because the possibility of some coupling of income inequality, on the one hand, with unequal advantages in converting incomes into capabilities, on the other. The latter tends to intensify the inequality problem already reflected in income inequality. For example, a person who is disabled, or ill, or old, or otherwise handicapped may, on the one hand, have problems in earning a decent income, and on the other, also face greater difficulties in converting income into capabilities and into living well. The very factors that may make a person unable to find a job and a good income, such as a disability, may put the person at a disadvantage in achieving a good quality of life even with the same job and earning the same income. This relationship between income-earning ability and income-using ability is a well-known empirical phenomenon in poverty studies. The interpersonal income inequality in the market outcomes may tend to be magnified by this coupling of low incomes with handicaps in the conversion of incomes into capabilities. The freedom efficiency of the market mechanism, on the one hand, and the seriousness of freedom inequality problems, on the other hand, are worth considering simultaneously. The equity problems have to be addressed, especially in dealing with serious deprivations and poverty, and in that context, social intervention including governmental support may well have an important role. To a great extent, this is exactly what the social security systems in welfare states try to achieve, through a variety of programs including social provision of healthcare, public support of the unemployed and the indigent, and so on. But the need to pay attention simultaneously to efficiency and equity aspects of the problem remains, since equity-motivated interference with the working of the market mechanism can weaken efficiency achievements even as it promotes equity. It is important to be clear about the need for simultaneity in considering the different aspects of social evaluation and justice. The need for synchronous consideration of distinct goals has already been faced in this work in several other contexts. For example, it was considered in Chapter 4 in contrasting the greater social commitment in Europe, more than in the United States, in guaranteeing minimal incomes and healthcare, with a greater social commitment in the United States, more than in Europe, in maintaining high levels of employment. The two types of commitments may be, to at least a considerable extent, combinable, but they may also be, at least partly, in conflict with each other. To the extent that there is a conflict, the need for simultaneity in considering the two issues together would be important in arriving at overall social priorities, paying attention to both efficiency and equity. Markets and interest groups. The role that markets play must depend not only on what they can do, but also on what they are allowed to do. There are many people whose interests are well served by the smooth functioning of markets, but there are also groups whose established interest may be hurt by such functioning. If the latter groups are politically more powerful and influential, then they can try to see that markets are not given adequate room in the economy. This can be a particularly serious problem when monopolistic production units flourish, despite inefficiency and various types of ineptitude, thanks to insulation from competition, domestic or foreign. The high product prices or the low product qualities that are involved in such artificially propped up production may impose significant sacrifice on the population at large, but an organized and politically influential group of industrialists can make sure that their profits are well protected. Adam Smith's complaint about the limited use of markets in 18th century Britain was concerned not only with pointing to the social advantages of well-functioning markets, but also with identifying the influence of vested interests in guaranteeing the insulation of their inflated profits from the threatening effects of competition. Indeed, Adam Smith saw the need to understand the working of markets to a great extent as an antidote to the argument standardly used by vested interests against giving competition an adequate role. Smith's intellectual arguments were partly aimed at countering the power and effectiveness of advocacy from entrenched interests. The market restrictions against which Smith was particularly vocal can be seen, in a broad sense, as pre-capitalist constraints. They differ from public intervention for, say, welfare programs or social safety nets, of which only rudimentary expressions could be found, at his time, in arrangements such as the Poor Laws. They also differ from the functioning of the state in providing such services as public education, of which Smith was very supportive. More on this presently. As it happens, many of the restrictions that bedevil the functioning of economies in developing countries today, or even allegedly socialist countries of yesterday, are also, broadly, of this pre-capitalist type. Whether we consider the prohibition of some types of domestic trade or international exchange, or the preservation of antiquated techniques and production methods in businesses owned and operated by quote-unquote protected bourgeoisie, there is a generic similarity between the sweeping advocacy of restricted competition and the flourishing of pre-capitalist values and habits of thought. The quote-unquote radicals of yesterday, such as Adam Smith, whose ideas inspired many of the activists in the French Revolution, or David Ricardo, who resisted Malthus's defense of the productive contribution of torpid landlords, or Karl Marx, who saw competitive capitalism as a major force for progressive change in the world, had little sympathy for the generally anti-market arguments of pre-capitalist leaders of thought. It is one of the ironies of the history of ideas that some who advocate radical politics today often fall for old economic positions that were so unequivocally rejected by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. Mikhail Kalecki's bitter grumble about restriction-ridden Poland, quote, "We have successfully abolished capitalism. All we have to do now is to abolish feudalism," which I quoted earlier, can be well appreciated in this light. It is not surprising that the protected bourgeoisie often do their best to encourage and support the illusion of radicalism and modernity in dusting up generically anti-market positions from the distant past. It is important to join these arguments through open-minded criticisms of the claims made in favor of general restriction of competition. This is not to deny that attention must also be paid to the political power of those groups that obtain substantial material benefits from restricting trade and exchange. Many authors have pointed out, with good reason, that the advocacies involved must be judged by identifying the vested interests involved, and by taking note of the influence of rent-seeking activities implicit in keeping competition away. As Vilfredo Parito pointed out, In a famous passage, if a certain measure A is the case of the loss of 1 franc to each of 1,000 persons, and of 1,000 francs to gain one individual, the latter will expend a great deal of energy, whereas the former will resist weakly. And it is likely that, in the end, the person who is attempting to secure the 1,000 francs via A will be successful. Political influence in search of economic gain is a very real phenomenon in the world in which we live. Confronting such influences has to occur not merely through resisting, and perhaps even exposing, to use an old-fashioned word, the seekers of profit from their captive markets, but also from taking on their intellectual arguments as proper subjects of scrutiny. Economics does have a long-standing tradition in that critical direction, going back at least to Adam Smith himself, who simultaneously pointed his accusing finger at the perpetrators and went on to debunk their claims in favor of the thesis of social benefits from disallowing competition. Smith argued that the vested interests tend to win because of their better knowledge of their own interest, not their knowledge of public interest. He wrote, "The interest of the dealers, however, in any particular branch of trade or manufactures, is always in some respects different from, and even opposite to that of the public. To widen the market and to narrow the competition is always in the interests of the dealers. To widen the market may frequently be agreeable enough to the interest of the public, but to narrow the competition must always be against it, and can serve only to enable the dealers, by raising their profits above what they would naturally be, to levy for their own benefit an absurd tax upon the rest of their fellow citizens. The proposal of any new law or regulation of commerce which comes from this order ought always to be listened to with great precaution, and ought never to be adopted till after having been long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most scrupulous attention. There is no reason why vested interests must win if open arguments are permitted and promoted. Even as Pareto's famous argument illustrates, there may be 1,000 people whose interests are a little hurt by the policy that heavily feeds into the interests of one businessman. And once the picture is seized with clarity, there may be no dearth of a majority in opposition to such special pleading. This is an ideal field for more public discussion of the claims and counterclaims on different sides, and in the test of open democracy, public interest may well have excellent prospects of winning against the spirited advocacy of the small coterie of vested interests. Here too, as in many other areas already examined in this book, the remedy has to lie in more freedom, including that of public discussion and participatory political decisions. Once again, freedom of one kind, in this case political freedom, can be seen as helping the realization of freedom of other kinds, particularly that of economic openness. Now, I seldom interject with my own opinion, but this really makes me think of a particular situation. And this book isn't so old, and it's not like it wasn't relevant back then either. But this makes me think of the climate crisis. And when it talks about the rent-seeking activities of the protected bourgeoisie, that's oil and gas. All across the world, we've seen big oil essentially blocking progressive environmental laws, sometimes even through utterly insidious institutions such as corporate courts, that essentially sue governments when they try and pass legislation to reduce carbon emissions, which obviously hurts us all in the long, and indeed not so much the long run anymore as the present day. All around the world there are an entirely unprecedented level of extreme weather events happening that are directly attributed to anthropogenic climate change. But the oil and gas industry want to continue making a profit, and so they block efforts to transition away from oil and into solar or wind or tidal or hydroelectric or indeed even nuclear energy. Anyway, I shan't go on and on about it. But sorry, actually, just to tie that back into what we've just discussed here. So obviously, if we had genuine, fair, participatory political discourse, then we would be able to challenge that openly. But instead, we're restricted in what we can say because of lobbying by these powerful interest groups. Need for critical scrutiny of the role of markets. Indeed, critical public discussion is an inescapably important requirement of good public policy, since the appropriate role and reach of markets cannot be predetermined on the basis of some grand general formula, or some all-encompassing attitude, either in favour of placing everything under the market, or of denying everything to the market. Even Adam Smith, while firmly advocating the use of markets where it could work well, and denying the merits of any general rejection of trade and exchange, did not hesitate to investigate economic circumstances in which particular restrictions may be sensibly proposed, or economic fields in which non-market institutions would be badly needed to supplement what the markets can do. It must not be presumed that Smith's critique of the market mechanism was always gentle, or, for that matter, that he got his critical points invariably right. Consider, for example, his advocacy of legal restriction on usury. Smith was, of course, opposed to any kind of general ban on charging interest on loans, as some anti-market thinkers had advocated. However, he wanted to have legal restrictions imposed by the state on the maximum rates of interest that could be charged. In countries where interest is permitted, the law, in order to prevent the extortion of usury, generally fixes the highest rate which can be taken without incurring a penalty. The legal rate, it is to be observed, though it ought to be somewhat above, ought not to be much above the lowest market rate. If the legal rate of interest in Great Britain, for example, was fixed so high as 8 or 10%, the greater part of the money which was to be lent would be lent to prodigals and projectors, who alone would be willing to give this high interest. Sober people, who will give for the use of money no more than a part of what they are likely to make by the use of it, would not venture into the competition. A great part of the capital of the country would thus be kept out of the hands which were most likely to make a profitable and advantageous use of it, and thrown into those which were most likely to waste and destroy it. In Smith's interventionist logic, the underlying argument is that the market signals can be misleading, and the consequences of the free market may be much waste of capital, resulting from private pursuit of misguided or myopic enterprises, or private waste of social resources. As it happens, Jeremy Bentham took Adam Smith to task in a long letter he wrote to Smith in March 1787, arguing for leaving the market alone. This is a rather remarkable episode in the history of economic thought, with the principal utilitarian interventionist lecturing the pioneering guru of market economics on the virtues of market allocation. The issue of a legally imposed maximum interest rate is not of much current interest in contemporary debates. In this respect, Bentham has clearly won over Smith. But it is important to see why Smith took such a negative view of the impact of prodigals and projectors on the economy. He was deeply concerned with the problem of social waste and the loss of productive capital. And he discussed in some detail how this could come about. Wealth of Nations, Book 2, Chapter 3. Regarding prodigals, Smith saw in them a great potential for social waste, driven as they are with the passion for present enjoyment. So it is that every prodigal appears to be a public enemy. Regarding projectors, Smith's worries related again to social waste. The effects of misconduct are often the same as those of prodigality. Every injudicious and unsuccessful project in agriculture, mines, fisheries, trade, or manufactures tends in the same manner to diminish the funds destined for the maintenance of productive labour. In every such project there must always be some diminution in what would otherwise have been the productive funds of society. It is not particularly important to assess these specific arguments of Smith, but it is important to see what his general concerns are. What he is considering is the possibility of social loss in the narrowly motivated pursuit of public gains. This is the opposite case to the more famous remark of Smith, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love." If the butcher-brewer-baker example draws our attention to the mutually beneficial role of trade based on self-interest, the prodigal projector argument points to the possibility that under certain circumstances, private profit motives may indeed run counter to social interests. It is this general concern that remains relevant today, not just the particular example of prodigals and projectors. This is very much the central apprehension in considering the social loss involved, for example, in environmentally wasteful or polluting private productions, which fit well with Smith's description of the possibility of some diminution in what would otherwise have been the productive funds of society. The lesson to draw from Smith's analysis of the market mechanism is not any massive strategy of jumping to policy conclusions from some general pro- or anti-attitude to markets. After acknowledging the role of trade and exchange in human living, we still have to examine what the other consequences of market transactions actually are. We have to evaluate the actual possibilities critically, with adequate attention being paid to the contingent circumstances that may be relevant in assessing all the results of encouraging markets, or of restraining their operation. If the butcher-brewer-baker example points to a very common circumstance in which our complementary interests are mutually promoted by exchange, the prodigal projector example illustrates the possibility that this may not work in quite that way in every case. There is no escape from the necessity of critical scrutiny. Need for a many-sided approach. The case for taking a broad and many-sided approach to development has become clearer in recent years, partly as a result of the difficulties faced as well as the successes achieved by different countries over the recent decades. These issues relate closely to the need for balancing the role of the government, and of other political and social institutions, with the functioning of markets. They would also suggest the relevance of a comprehensive development framework of the kind discussed by James Wolfensohn, the president of the World Bank. This type of framework involves rejecting a compartmentalized view of the process of development, for example, going just for liberalization or some other single overarching process. The search for a single all-purpose remedy, such as open the markets or get the prices right, has had much hold on professional thinking in the past, and indeed the present, not least in the World Bank itself. Instead, an integrated and multifaceted approach is needed, with the object of making simultaneous progress on different fronts, including different institutions, which reinforce each other. Broader approaches are often harder to sell than narrowly focused reforms that try to achieve one thing at a time. This may help to explain why the powerful intellectual leadership of Manmohan Singh in bringing about the needed economic reforms in India in 1991 was so concentrated on liberalization only, without a corresponding focus on the much-needed broadening of social opportunities. There is, however, quite a deep complementarity between reducing, on the one hand, the overactivity of the state in running a license Raj, and on the other, removing the underactivity of the state in the continuing neglect of elementary education and other social opportunities, with close to half the adult Indians still illiterate and quite unable to participate in an increasingly globalized economy. In the event, Manmohan Singh did initiate some essential reforms, and this is a rightly admired success. And yet that success could have been even greater if the reforms were combined with a commitment to expand the development of social opportunities that had been neglected so persistently in India. Combining extensive use of markets with the development of social opportunities must be seen as a part of a still broader comprehensive approach that also emphasizes freedoms of other kinds, democratic rights, security guarantees, opportunities of cooperation, and so on. In this book, the identification of different instrumental freedoms, such as economic entitlements, democratic freedoms, social opportunities, transparency guarantees, and protective security, is based on the recognition of their respective roles as well as their complementarities. Depending on the country considered, the focus of a critique may vary in light of the particular experience in that country. For example, in India, the neglect of social opportunities may be a focus of criticism in a way that it may not be in China, whereas the absence of democratic liberties may be more appropriately a focus of critique of China than it could be of India. Interdependence and public goods. Those who have tended to take the market mechanism to be the best solution of every economic problem may want to inquire what the limits of that mechanism may be. I have already commented on issues of equity and the need to go beyond efficiency considerations, and in that context I have tried to discuss why this may call for supplementing the market mechanism by other institutional activities. But even in achieving efficiency, the market mechanism may sometimes be less than effective, particularly in the presence of what are called public goods. One of the assumptions standardly made to show the efficiency of the market mechanism is that every commodity, and more generally everything on which our welfares depend, can be bought and sold in the market. It can all be marketed, if we want to place it there, and there is no non-marketable but significant influence on our welfare. In fact, however, some of the most important contributors to human capability may be hard to sell exclusively to one person at a time. This is especially so when we consider the so-called public goods, which people consume together rather than separately. This applies particularly in fields such as environmental preservation and also epidemiology and public health care. I may be willing to pay my share in a social program of malaria eradication, but I cannot buy my part of that protection in the form of private good, like an apple or a shirt. It is a public good, malaria-free surroundings, which we have to consume together. Indeed, if I do manage somehow to organize a malaria-free environment where I live, my neighbor too will have that malaria-free environment without having to buy it from anywhere. The rationale of the market mechanism is geared to private goods, like apples and shirts, rather than to public goods, like the malaria-free environment, and it can be shown that there may be a good case for the provisioning of public goods going beyond what the private markets would foster. Exactly similar arguments regarding the limited reach of the market mechanism apply to several other important fields as well, where too the provision involved may take the form of a public good. Defense, policing, and environmental protection are some of the fields in which this kind of reasoning applies. There are also rather mixed cases. For example, given the shared communal benefits of basic education, which may transcend the gains of the person being educated, basic education may have a public good component as well, and can be seen as a semi-public good. The persons receiving education do, of course, benefit from it, but in addition, a general expansion of the education and literacy in a region can facilitate social change, even the reduction of fertility and mortality, as will be discussed more fully in chapters 8 and 9, and also help to enhance economic progress, from which others too benefit. The effective reach of these services may require cooperative activities and provisioning by the state or the local authorities. Indeed, the state has typically played a major role in the expansion of basic education across the world. The rapid spread of literacy in the past history of the rich countries of today, both in the West and in Japan and the rest of East Asia, has drawn on the low cost of public education combined with its shared public benefits. It is in this context rather remarkable that some market enthusiasts recommend now to the developing countries that they should rely fully on the free market even for basic education, thereby withholding from them the very process of educational expansion that was crucial in rapidly spreading literacy in Europe, North America, Japan, and East Asia in the past. The alleged followers of Adam Smith can learn something from his writings on the subject, including his frustration at the parsimony of public expenditure in the field of education. For a very small expense, the public can facilitate, can encourage, and can even impose upon almost the whole body of the people the necessity of acquiring those most essential parts of education. The public goods argument for going beyond the market mechanism supplements the case for social provisioning that arises from the need of basic capabilities, such as elementary healthcare and basic educational opportunities. Efficiency considerations thus supplement the argument for equity in supporting public assistance in providing basic education, health facilities, and other public or semi-public goods. Public provisioning and incentives. While these considerations provide good grounds for public expenditure in the areas crucial for economic development and social change, there are contrary arguments that must also be considered in the same context. One issue is that of the fiscal burden of public expenditure, which can be quite large depending on how much is planned to be done. The fear of budget deficits and inflation, and generally of macroeconomic instability, tends to haunt contemporary discussions of economic policy, and this is indeed a momentous issue. Another issue is that of incentives and the effects that a system of public support may have in discouraging initiative and distorting individual efforts. Both these issues, the need for fiscal prudence and the importance of incentives, deserve serious attention. I begin with the latter and will come back thereafter to fiscal burden and its consequences. Any pure transfer, the redistribution of income or the free provision of a public service, can potentially have an effect on the incentive system of the economy. For example, it has been argued particularly strongly that generous unemployment insurance can weaken the resolve of the jobless to find employment, and that it has actually done so in Europe. Given the obvious equity argument for such insurance, there may be a difficult issue here if the potential conflict proves to be real and quantitatively substantial. However, since employment is sought for various reasons, not just to receive an income, the partial replacement of the lost wage by public support may not in fact be as much of a disincentive against seeking employment as it is sometimes presumed. Indeed, the reach and magnitude of the disincentive effects of unemployment insurance are far from clear. Nevertheless, it is a matter for empirical examination to ascertain how strong the adverse incentive effects may actually be, in order to facilitate informed public discussion of these important matters of public policy, including the choice of an appropriate balance between equity and efficiency. In most of the developing countries, there are few provisions for unemployment insurance in general. But the incentive problem is not absent for that reason. Even for free medical care and health services or free educational facilities, questions can be raised regarding 1. The extent of the need for these services by the recipients, and 2. The extent to which the person could have afforded to pay for these services himself, and might have done so in the absence of free public provisioning. Those who see entitlement to these basic social provisions, medical attention, education, and so on, as an inalienable right of citizens, would tend to see this kind of questioning as wrong-headed, and even perhaps as a distressing denial of the normative principles of a contemporary society. That position is certainly defendable up to a point, but given the limitation of economic resources, there are serious choices involved here, which cannot be altogether neglected on the grounds of some pre-economic social principle. At any rate, the incentive issue has to be addressed, if only because of the extent of social support that a society would be able to provide must depend in part on costs and incentives. Incentives, capabilities, and functionings. The basic problem of incentives is hard to overcome completely. It is, in general, quite hopeless to look for some indicators that are both relevant for identifying deprivation and, when used as the basis of public support, would not lead to any incentive effects. However, the extent of the incentive effects can vary with the nature and form of the criteria used. The informational focus of poverty analysis in this work has involved a shift in attention from low income to deprivation of basic capabilities. The central argument for this shift is fundamental rather than strategic. I have argued that capability deprivation is more important as a criterion of disadvantage than is the lowness of income, since income is only instrumentally important and its derivative value is contingent on many social and economic circumstances. That argument can now be supplemented by the suggestion that focusing on capability deprivation has some advantage in preventing incentive distortions compared with working with lowness of income as a criterion for transfer and subsidy. This instrumental argument only adds to the fundamental reason for focusing on capabilities. The assessment of capabilities has to proceed primarily on the basis of observing a person's actual functionings, to be supplemented by other information. There is a jump here from functionings to capabilities, but it need not be a big jump, if only because the valuation of actual functionings is one way of assessing how a person values the options she has. If a person dies prematurely or suffers from a painful and threatening disease, it would be, in most cases, legitimate to conclude that she did have a capability problem. Of course, in some cases this will not be true. For example, a person may commit suicide, or she may starve not out of necessity, but because of a decision to fast. But these are relatively rare occurrences and can be analysed on the basis of supplementary information, which would relate, in the case of fasting, to religious practices, or political strategies, or other such reasons for fasting. In principle, it is right to go beyond chosen functionings to assess a person's capability, but how far one would be able to go would depend on the circumstances. Public policy, like politics, is the art of the possible, and this is important to bear in mind in combining theoretical insights with realistic readings of practical feasibility. What is, however, important to emphasize is that even with the informational focus confined to functionings, like longevity, health status, literacy, and so on, we get a more instructive measure of deprivation than we can from income statistics alone. There are, of course, problems even in observing functioning achievements of some kinds. But some of the more basic and elementary ones are more amenable to direct observation, and frequently enough provide useful informational bases for anti-deprivation policies. The informational basis for seeing the need for literacy campaigns, hospital services, and nutritional supplementation need not be particularly obscure. Furthermore, these needs and handicaps may be less open to strategic distortion than the handicap of low income, since income is often easy to hide, especially in most developing countries. If governmental grants were to be given to people on the ground of their poverty alone, leaving them to pay for medical care, educational facilities, and so on out of their own incomes, there is likely to be considerable information manipulation. The focus on functionings and capabilities, extensively used in this work, tends to reduce the difficulties of incentive compatibility. Why so? First, people may typically be reluctant to refuse education, foster illnesses, or cultivate undernourishment on purely tactical grounds. The priorities of reasoning and choice tend to militate against deliberately promoting these elementary deprivations. There are, of course, exceptions. Among the most distressing accounts of the famine relief experiences are the occasional reports of some parents keeping one child in the family thoroughly famished so that the family qualifies to get nutritional support, for example in the form of take-home food rations, treating the child, as it were, as a meal ticket. But in general, such incentive effects in keeping people undernourished or untreated or illiterate are relatively rare, for reasons that are not altogether astonishing. Second, the causal factors underlying some functional deprivations can go much deeper than income deprivation and may be very hard to adjust for purely tactical reasons. For example, physical disabilities, old age, gender characteristics, and the like are particularly serious sources of capability handicap because they are beyond the control of the persons involved. And for very much the same reason, they are not open to incentive distortions in the way that adjustable features are. This limits the incentive distortions of subsidies targeted on these features. Third, there is also the somewhat larger issue that the recipients themselves tend to pay more attention to functionings and capabilities achieved, and the quality of life that goes with them, than to just earning more money. And in this way, public policy assessment that is done in terms of variables closer to the decisional concerns of individuals may be able to use personal decisions as selection devices. This question relates to the use of self-selection in providing public assistance, with requirement of work and effort, as is frequently practiced in providing famine relief. Only those who are destitute and need money strongly enough to be willing to work reasonably hard for it will volunteer to take up the open opportunities of employment, often at a somewhat low wage, which constitute a widely used form of public relief. This type of targeting has been used very successfully in providing famine prevention and can have a wider role in enhancing the economic opportunities of the able-bodied deprived population. The rationale of this approach lies in the fact that the potential recipient's choices are governed by considerations that are broader than maximization of income earned. Since the individuals involved focus more on overall opportunities, including the human cost of effort as well as the benefit from extra income, public policy making can make intelligent use of this broader concern. Fourth, the refocusing of attention from low personal incomes to capability handicaps also points directly to the case for greater emphasis on direct public provisioning of such facilities as health services and educational programs. These services are typically non-shiftable and non-saleable, and of not much use to a person unless he or she actually happens to need them. There is some built-in matching in such provisioning, and this feature of capability-directed provisioning makes targeting easier by reducing the scope for incentive distortions. Targeting and means testing. However, despite these advantages, the decision to target capability handicaps rather than low income does not, in itself, eliminate the need to judge the economic poverty of the potential recipients, since there is also the further issue of how the public provisions should be distributed. There is in particular the issue of charging for the public services according to the ability to pay, which would bring back the need for ascertaining the income of the potential recipient. The provisioning of public services has increasingly moved in the direction of means testing across the world. The case for this is easy to understand, at least in principle. It reduces the fiscal burden, and the same amount of public funds can be stretched much further in covering the economically needy if the relatively affluent can be made to pay for the benefits they receive, or induced to make a significant contribution to the costs involved. What is more difficult to ensure is that the means be effectively tested with acceptable accuracy, without leading to other adverse effects. We must distinguish clearly between two different incentive problems in providing healthcare or education on the basis of means testing, related respectively to the information regarding 1. A person's capability handicap, for example, her physical illness, and 2. Her economic circumstances and her ability to pay. As far as the first problem is concerned, the form and fungibility of the help provided can make a significant difference. As was discussed earlier, when social support is given on the basis of direct diagnosis of a specific need, for example after checking that a person is suffering from some particular illness, and when it is provided free in the form of specific and non-transferable services, such as being medically treated for that ailment, the possibility of informational distortion of the first kind would be substantially reduced. There is a contrast here with providing fungible money for financing medical treatment, which would require more indirect scrutiny. On this score, the direct service programs such as healthcare and school education are less open to abuse. But the second issue is quite different. If the intention is to provide free service for the poor but not for those who can afford to pay, there is the further issue of checking the person's economic circumstances. This can be particularly problematic, especially in countries where information on income and wealth is hard to elicit. The European formula of targeting the capability handicap without means testing in providing medical coverage has tended to take the form of a general national health service, open to all who need those medical services. This makes the informational task easier, but does not address the rich-poor division. The American formula of Medicaid targets both at a more modest level and has to cope with both the informational challenges. Since the potential beneficiaries are also agents of action, the art of targeting is far less simple than some advocates of means testing tend to assume. It is important to take note of the problems involved in fine-tuned targeting in general and means testing in particular, especially since the case for such targeting is in principle quite strong and cogent. The possible distortions that may result from attempts at ambitious targeting include the following. 1. Information distortion. Any policing system that tries to catch the cheats who underestimate their financial circumstances would make mistakes from time to time and disqualify some bona fide cases. No less important, it would discourage some who are genuinely qualified to receive the intended benefits from applying for the benefits to which they are entitled. Given the asymmetry of information, it is not possible to eliminate cheating without putting some of the honest beneficiaries at considerable risk. In trying to eliminate the type 1 error of including the non-needy among the needy, serious type 2 errors of not including some really needy people among the listed needy would very likely be committed. 2. Incentive distortion. Informational distortion cooks the books, but does not on its own alter the underlying real economic situation. But targeted support can also affect people's economic behavior. For example, the prospect of losing the support if one were to earn too much can be a deterrent for economic activities. It would be natural to expect that there would be some significant distorting shifts if the qualification for the support is based on a variable, such as income, that is freely adjustable through changing one's economic behavior. The social costs of behavioral shifts must include, among other things, the loss of the fruits of economic activities foregone. 3. Disutility and stigma. A system of support that requires a person to be identified as poor and is seen as a special benefaction for those who cannot fully fend for themselves would tend to have some effects on one's self-respect, as well as on respect by others. This may distort the seeking of help, but also there are direct costs and losses involved in feeling, and being, stigmatized. Since the matter of self-respect is often taken by policy leaders to be of rather marginal interest, and considered to be a rather genteel concern, I take the liberty of referring to John Rawls' argument that self-respect is perhaps the most important primary good, on which a theory of justice as fairness has to concentrate. 4. Administrative costs, invasive loss, and corruption. The procedure of targeting can involve substantial administrative costs in the form of both resource expenditures and bureaucratic delays, and also the losses of individual privacy and autonomy involved in the need for extensive disclosure and the associated program of investigation and policing. There are, furthermore, social costs of asymmetrical power that the potentates of bureaucracy enjoy vis-à-vis the supplicating applicants. And it should be added, there is a greater possibility of corruption here, since the potentates acquire, in a targeting system, the power to bestow benefits for which the beneficiaries may be willing to make a facilitating payment. 5. Political sustainability and quality. The beneficiaries of targeted social support are often quite weak politically and may lack the clout to sustain the programs in political jostling, or to maintain the quality of the services offered. In the United States, this consideration has been the basis of some well-known arguments for having universal programs, which would receive wider support, rather than heavily targeted ones confined only to the poorest. Something of this argument cannot but relate to the poorer countries as well. The point of outlining these difficulties is not to suggest that targeting must be pointless or always problematic, but only to note that there are considerations that run counter to the simple argument for maximal targeting. Targeting is, in fact, an attempt, not a result. Even when successfully targeted outcomes would be just right, it does not necessarily follow that attempts in the form of targeted programs would produce those outcomes. Since the case for means testing and for heavy targeting has gained so much ground recently in public circles, based on rather elementary reasoning, the messiness and the disincentive effects of the proposed policy are also worth emphasizing. Agency and informational basis. It would be rather hopeless to try and get a case for a universal endorsement or a universal rejection of means testing on the basis of very general arguments. And the relevance of the preceding discussion lies mainly in pointing to the contrary arguments that exist side by side with the arguments in favor of fine-tuned means testing. In practice, in this field, as in many others already considered, compromises would have to be made. In a general work of this kind, it would be a mistake to look for some particular formula for an optimum compromise. The right approach would have to be sensitive to the circumstances involved, both the nature of the public services to be offered and the characteristics of the society to which they are to be offered. The latter must include the hold of behavioral values of different kinds, which influence individual choices and incentives. However, the basic issues confronted here are some of general interest for the main approach of this book, and involve both the importance of agency, seeing people as agents rather than as patients, and the informational focus on capability deprivation, rather than only on income poverty. The first question relates to the need, emphasized throughout this work, to see people, even beneficiaries, as agents rather than as motionless patients. The objects of targeting are active themselves, and their activities can make the targeting achievements quite different from targeting attempts, for reasons already discussed. The second question relates to the informational aspects of targeting. These include the identifiability of the characteristics relevant for the chosen system of allocation. Here, the shift in attention from just income poverty to the deprivation of capabilities helps the task of identifiability. While means testing still requires that income and the ability to pay be identified, nevertheless, the other part of the exercise is helped by the direct diagnosis of capability handicap, such as being ill or illiterate. This is a part, an important part, of the information task of public provisioning. Financial prudence and the need for integration. I turn now to the problem of financial prudence, which has become a major concern across the world in recent decades. The demands for conservatism in finance are very strong now, since the disruptive effects of excessive inflation and instability have come to be widely studied and discussed. Indeed, finance is a subject in which conservatism has some evident merit, and prudence in this field can easily take a conservative form. But we have to be clear as to what financial conservatism demands and why. The point of financial conservatism is not so much the apparently conspicuous merit of living within one's means, even though that rhetoric has much appeal. As Mr. Micawber put it rather eloquently in Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, annual income £20, annual expenditure 19.6, result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20.06, result, misery. The analogy with personal solvency has been powerfully used by many financial conservatives, perhaps most eloquently by Margaret Thatcher. This argument does not, however, provide a clear rule for state policy. Unlike Mr. Micawber, a state can continue to spend more than it earns through borrowing and other means. In fact, nearly every state does so nearly all the time. The real issue is not whether this can be done, it certainly can be, but what the effects of financial overspending might be. The basic issue to be faced, therefore, is the consequential importance of what is sometimes called macroeconomic stability, in particular the absence of serious inflationary pressure. The case for financial conservatism lies, to a great extent, in the recognition that price stability is important and that it can be deeply threatened by fiscal indulgence and irresponsibility. What evidence do we have about the pernicious effects of inflation? In a powerful critical survey of international experiences in this area, Michael Bruno notes that several recorded episodes of moderate inflation, 20 to 40%, price rise per year, and most instances of higher rates of inflation, of which there have been a substantial number, suggests that high inflation goes together with significant negative growth effects. And conversely, the cumulative evidence suggests that sharp stabilization from high inflation brings very strong positive growth effects over even the short to medium run. The policy conclusion to be drawn here requires some subtlety. Bruno also finds that the growth effects of inflation are at best obscure at low rates of inflation, less than 15 to 20% annually. He goes on to ask the question, why worry about low rates of inflation, especially if the costs of anticipated inflation can be avoided by indexation, and those of unanticipated inflation seem to be so low? Bruno also points out that while the root of all high inflations is a financial deficit, and often, though not always, the monetary finance of it, this in turn can be consistent with multiple inflationary equilibria. The real problem lies in the fact that inflation is an inherently persistent process, and, moreover, the degree of persistence tends to increase with the rate of inflation. Bruno presents a clear picture of how such acceleration of inflation takes place, and makes the lesson graphic with an analogy. Chronic inflation tends to resemble smoking. Once you are beyond a minimal number, it is very difficult to escape a worsening addiction. In fact, when shocks occur, for example a personal crisis for a smoker, a price crisis for an economy, there is a great chance that the severity of the habit will jump to a new, higher level that persists even after the shock has abated, and this process can repeat itself. This is a quintessentially conservative argument, and a very persuasive one it is, based as it is on a rich set of international comparisons. I have no difficulty in endorsing both the analysis and the conclusions drawn by Michael Bruno. What is, however, important to do is to keep track of exactly what has been established and also to see what the demand of financial conservatism really is. It is in particular not a demand for what I would call the anti-inflationary radicalism that is often confused with financial conservatism. The case made is not for eliminating inflation altogether, irrespective of what has to be sacrificed for that end. Rather, the lesson is to keep in view the likely costs of tolerating inflation against the costs of reducing it, or of eliminating it altogether. The critical issue is to avoid the dynamic instability that even seemingly stable chronic inflation tends to have, if it is above a low figure. The policy lesson that Bruno draws is the combination of costly stabilization at the low rates of inflation and the upward bias of inflationary persistence provide a growth cost-related argument for keeping inflation low, even though the large growth costs seem to be directly observed only at higher inflations. The thing to avoid in this argument is not just high inflation, but, because of dynamic instability, even moderate inflation. However, radicalism in the cause of zero inflation does not emerge here either as particularly wise or even as the appropriate reading of the demands of financial conservatism. The clouding of distinct issues is seen clearly enough in the ongoing fixation with the balancing the budget in the United States, which resulted not long ago in partial shutdowns of the US government and threats of more extensive closures. This has led to an uneasy compromise between the White House and the Congress, a compromise the success of which is rather contingent on the short-run performance of the US economy. Anti-deficit radicalism has to be distinguished from genuine financial conservatism. There is indeed a strong case for reducing the large budget deficits that are seen in many countries in the world, often made worse by huge burdens of national debt and high rates of its escalation. But this argument must not be confused with the extremism of trying to eliminate budget deficits altogether with great rapidity, no matter what the social cost of this might be. Europe has much more reason to be concerned about budget deficits than the United States has. For one thing, the US budget deficits have been, for many years now, moderate enough to be below the norms set up by the Maastricht Agreement for the European Monetary Union, a budget deficit of no more than 3% of gross domestic product. There seems to be no deficit at all at this time. In contrast, most of the European countries had, and still have, rather substantial deficits. It is appropriate that several of these countries are currently making determined attempt to cut the levels of these large deficits. Italy has provided an impressive example of this in recent years. If there is a question to be raised still, this concerns the overall priorities of European policies, an issue that was discussed earlier in Chapter 4. The point at issue is whether it makes sense to give absolute priority to one objective only, viz. The avoidance of inflation, a priority formalized by many central banks in Western Europe, while tolerating remarkably high rates of unemployment. If the analysis presented in this book is right, the making of public policy in Europe has to give real priority to eliminating the capability deprivation that severe unemployment entails. Financial conservatism has good rationale and imposes strong requirements, but its demands must be interpreted in the light of the overall objectives of public policy. The role of public expenditure in generating and guaranteeing many basic capabilities calls for attention. It must be considered along with the instrumental need for macroeconomic stability. Indeed, the latter need must be assessed within a broad framework of social objectives. Depending on the particular context, different public policy issues may end up being critically important. In Europe, it could be the nastiness of massive unemployment, close to 12% for several major countries. In the United States, a crucial challenge is presented by the absence of any kind of medical insurance or secure coverage for very large numbers of people. The United States is alone among the rich countries in having this problem, and furthermore, the medically uninsured number more than 40 million. In India, there is a massive failure of public policy in the extreme neglect of literacy. Half the adult population and 2/3 of the adult women are still illiterate. In East Asia and Southeast Asia, it looks increasingly as if the financial system requires extensive regularization, and there also seems to be a need for a preventative system that can counteract sudden losses of confidence in a country's currency or investment opportunities, as is brought out by the recent experiences of these countries, which had to seek gigantic bailout operations by the International Monetary Fund. The problems are different, and given their complexity, each calls for a serious examination of the objectives and instruments of public policy. The need for financial conservatism, important as it is, fits into this diverse and broad picture and cannot stand on its own, in solitary isolation, as the commitment of government or of the central bank. The need for scrutiny and comparative assessment of alternative fields of public expenditure is altogether crucial. Concluding remarks. Individuals live and operate in a world of institutions. Our opportunities and prospects depend crucially on what institutions exist and how they can function. Not only do institutions contribute to our freedoms, their roles can be sensibly evaluated in the light of their contributions to our freedom. To see development as freedom provides a perspective in which institutional assessment can systematically occur. Even though different commentators have chosen to focus on particular institutions, such as the market, or the democratic system, or the media, or the public distribution system, we have to view them together to be able to see what they can or cannot do in combination with other institutions. It is in this integrated perspective that the different institutions can be reasonably assessed and examined. The market mechanism, which arouses passion in favor as well as against, is a basic arrangement through which people can interact with each other and undertake mutually advantageous activities. In this light, it is very hard indeed to see how any reasonable critic could be against the market mechanism as such. The problems that arise spring typically from other sources, not from the existence of markets per se, and include such concerns as inadequate preparedness to make use of market transactions, unconstrained concealment of information, or unregulated use of activities that allow the powerful to capitalize on their asymmetrical advantage. These have to be dealt with not by suppressing the markets, but by allowing them to function better and with greater fairness, and with adequate supplementation. The overall achievements of the market are deeply contingent on political and social arrangements. The market mechanism has achieved great success under those conditions in which the opportunities offered by them could be reasonably shared. In making this possible, the provision of basic education, the presence of elementary medical facilities, the availability of resources, such as land, that can be crucial to some activities, such as agriculture, call for appropriate public policies, involving schooling, healthcare, land reform, and so on. Even when the need for economic reform in favour of allowing more room for markets is paramount, these non-market facilities require careful and determined public action. In this chapter, and in earlier ones, various examples of this complementarity have been considered and examined. The efficiency contributions of the market mechanism can hardly be doubted, and traditional economic results in which efficiency is judged by prosperity or opulence or utility can be extended to efficiency in terms of individual freedoms as well. But these efficiency results do not, on their own, guarantee distributional equity. The problem can be particularly large in the context of inequality of substantive freedoms, when there is a coupling of disadvantages, such as the difficulty of a disabled or untrained person to earn an income being reinforced by her difficulty in making use of the income for the capability to live well. The far-reaching powers of the market mechanism have to be supplemented by the creation of basic social opportunities for social equity and justice. In the context of developing countries in general, the need for public policy initiatives in creating social opportunities is crucially important. As was discussed earlier, in the past of the rich countries of today, we can see quite a remarkable history of public action, dealing respectively with education, healthcare, land reforms, and so on. The wide sharing of these social opportunities made it possible for the bulk of the people to participate directly in the process of economic expansion. The real problem here is not the need for financial conservatism in itself, but the underlying, and often unargued, belief that has been dominant in some policy circles that human development is really a kind of luxury that only richer countries can afford. Perhaps the most important impact of the type of success that East Asian economies have recently had, beginning with Japan decades earlier, is the total undermining of that implicit prejudice. These economies went comparatively early for massive expansion of education and later also of healthcare, and they did this, in many cases, before they broke the restraints of general poverty. And despite the financial turmoil that some of these economies have recently experienced, their overall achievements over the decades have typically been quite remarkable. As far as human resources are concerned, they have reaped as they have sown. Indeed, the priority to human resource development applies particularly to the early history of Japanese economic development, particularly with the Meiji era in the mid-19th century. That priority has not really intensified as Japan has grown richer and much more opulent. Human development is first and foremost an ally of the poor, rather than of the rich and affluent. What does human development do? The creation of social opportunities makes a direct contribution to the expansion of human capabilities and the quality of life, as has already been discussed. Expansion of healthcare, education, social security, etc. contribute directly to the quality of life and to its flourishing. There is every evidence that even with relatively low income, a country that guarantees healthcare and education to all can actually achieve remarkable results in terms of the length and quality of life of the entire population. The highly labour-intensive nature of healthcare and basic education, and human development in general, makes them comparatively cheap in the early stages of economic development, when labour costs are low. The rewards of human development go, as we have seen, well beyond the direct enhancement of quality of life, and include also its impact on people's productive abilities and thus on economic growth on a widely shared basis. Literacy and numeracy help the participation of the masses in the process of economic expansion, well illustrated from Japan to Thailand. To use the opportunities of global trade, quality control, as well as production to specification, can be quite crucial, and they are hard for illiterate or innumerate labourers to achieve and maintain. Furthermore, there is considerable evidence that improved healthcare, as well as nutrition, also make the workforce more productive and better remunerated. On a different subject, there is much confirmation in the contemporary empirical literature of the impact of education, especially female education, on reducing fertility rates. High fertility rates can be seen, with much justice, as adverse to the quality of life, especially of young women, since recurrent bearing and rearing of children can be very detrimental to the well-being and freedom of the young mother. Indeed, it is precisely this connection that makes the empowerment of women, through more outside employment, more school education, and so on, so effective in reducing fertility rates, since young women have a strong reason for moderating birth rates, and their ability to influence family decisions increases with their empowerment. I shall come back to this issue in chapters 8 and 9. Those who see themselves as financial conservatives sometimes express skepticism about human development. There is, however, little rational basis for that inference. The benefits of human development are manifest, and can be more fully accounted by taking an adequately comprehensive view of its overall impact. Cost consciousness can help to direct human development in channels that are more productive, directly and indirectly, of the quality of life, but it does not threaten its imperative interest. Indeed, what really should be threatened by financial conservatism is the use of public resources for purposes where the social benefits are very far from clear, such as the massive expenditures that now go into the military in one poor country after another, often many times larger than the public expenditure on basic education or healthcare. Financial conservatism should be the nightmare of the militarist, not of the school teacher or the hospital nurse. It is an indication of the topsy-turvy world in which we live that the school teacher or the nurse feels more threatened by financial conservatism than does the army general. The rectification of this anomaly calls not for the chastising of financial conservatism, but for more pragmatic and open-minded scrutiny of rival claims to social funds.